This afternoon, as you know, we will begin some Ngundro teachings. For those of you that wish to become involved with the Ngundro teachings, you're perfectly welcome to do so. I think that before you make such a decision, and perhaps even at the same time as you make such a decision, there are certain things that we must consider, that one must consider. As I say, before making that decision and at the same time as making that decision. There is something of a confusing directive that we receive when we first enter into the path officially of practicing the Buddha Dharma. And that is, first of all, the Buddha teaches us that we should be very discerning, that we should examine the teachings for ourselves, and we should not accept any teaching that doesn't seem logical to us. That, in other words, the Buddha does not recommend blind faith at all. In other religions, we are given a certain text, a certain book, and we are told that this comes from God, and so there's nothing to think about. You know, you just have to kind of accept that. And in fact, for instance, in the history of Christianity, and I really don't know how it is now, but I know that early on in the history of Christianity, the church actually strongly discouraged people from determining for themselves whether in fact that book came from God, that that was sinful, that you should not think like that at all. You should just assume because the priests said that it was so, that the book came from God, or that it came from, that it was something that you should accept immediately. And that became doable in that the church was so prevalent and the priests were so active in that kind of, in fortifying that kind of belief, that cultures and civilizations really accepted the Bible, for instance, as being the Word of God, and that was it. They never thought about anything further than that. And they were given what they were given to study and to read, and they accepted from the priests only that, assuming that if the priests gave us only that much, that was all that we needed. There was a great deal of that kind of thing there. The Buddha actually has a different way of presenting the teachings to the world. That the Buddha first of all requests us to determine for ourselves whether or not there is even a point to seek anything out spiritually. The Buddha suggests to us that we look at the world and examine the world in as clear a way as possible. Of course, with that, the Buddha makes some suggestions as guideposts. And personally, I have found that these suggestions are useful and necessary simply because people can be deluded. They can confuse themselves, or they can be so susceptible to the comings and goings of their feelings that sometimes they don't have a very clear view at every single moment. For instance, the Buddha suggests that we examine the faults of cyclic existence. That means the cycle of birth and death, the continual cycle of birth and death. It is visible to us and seeable to us that we began as babies, that all things seem to have some kind of birth that brings them into the cycle of birth and death. We so far haven't seen anyone just appear in an adult form right in the middle of, say, M Street, you know, and just be there and say, oh, well, another one's here. We've never seen that happen. So we know from our own experience that pretty much everyone has come into this cycle of birth and death through the experience of birth, and different sentient beings do it different ways. We know that human beings come from their mothers, and we know that chickens come from eggs, and we know that fish do their thing, whatever it is that fish do. I haven't kept up on that, actually. And different kinds of life forms have their ways of being brought into cyclic existence. So we know that that's true. And the Buddha teaches that we leave the realm of cyclic existence, we leave the present incarnation through dying. There are myths and there are stories and there are ancient religious instructions even about beings who have gone away in a flash of lightning or some kind of crazy thing like that. I'm thinking of the story of Enoch in the Old Testament. That's a kind of a wild story, but I have no reason to disbelieve it. It seems possible to me that Enoch was a very realized being and could have done something really miraculous. And there are stories in our religion of Buddhism, our philosophy of Buddhism, in which great leaders have attained some level of bodhisattvahood or Buddhahood, and they have left in some miraculous way that they wouldn't really die. It would be a different kind of process. For us, however, I've never seen that. I've never seen that with my own two eyes. But what I have seen repeatedly is that people die. I've seen animals die, haven't you? Seen people die? We've all had that experience of watching someone or some creature die. So that has been our experience. That doesn't disagree with the Buddha's teaching. According to the Buddha's teaching, upon attaining enlightenment, one can enter into nirvana. There can be miraculous signs. There can be some extraordinary events. In fact, the Buddha teaches that when one reaches enlightenment, one is actually released from cyclic existence. One is not a part of cyclic existence anymore. There is a different event that takes place there. But that while one is involved in cyclic existence, while that is the case, we do experience birth and death. I've never seen anything to disprove that. But sentient beings that we are can get kind of deluded, can't we? We can sort of forget all of that. We can think that, well, gee, I've lived 40 years so far, no reason to think I won't continue forever. Or we can think, well, I'm only 40 years old, probably I'll live another 40 years, so I don't really have to get too busy trying to perfect my mind right now. I can wait till I'm maybe 60. Or I can think about doing that after I retire. Or I can think about doing that after my kids grow up. Which really means that we're not getting the death thing. We're not getting that it could happen tomorrow. We've seen it happen to people that we know. We've seen bugs walk across the street having no idea that they were about to bite the big tamale. We have seen people, we've seen dogs die, we've seen cats die, we've seen people die. We've seen people die in the prime of life. We've seen people become afflicted in the prime of life so that there's no longer any potential for them to practice. You know, something can happen to one's mind. One can be seemingly okay and then have some sort of nervous breakdown. Or one can be seemingly okay and then lose their faculties somehow, catch some disease that so totally changes their quality of perception that they can no longer practice. Well, maybe they do still live till they're 80, but maybe it's not possible for them to practice. So all kinds of things can happen, but we just can't remember that lesson. We just can't be cognizant of that. It's like we get confused. It's kind of like we're drunk on this life experience. We seem to have this quality of being here right now and thinking, this is it. Even though we know, we can look and we can see that we haven't always looked like this. We were babies once. We were small children once. We even have pictures of it. There was a time when we were too young to practice. There was a time when we were too busy to practice. Why do we think that we're going to be like this forever? Why don't we get the fact that perhaps maybe there'll be a time when we're too old to practice? I mean, it's logical. If we were once too young to practice, we might be too old to practice. Our minds might change, or we might have some of the the cloudiness that sometimes occurs with the aging process. Why isn't that possible for us? What makes you think that it's 100% locked up? And we look at this present moment and it's almost like we're duped with it. We're just sort of complacent and we sort of rest in it, not really resting exactly, but we sort of sit in it thinking, yeah, that's it, I'm fine now. I'm fine now. So you're fine now. But like that little bug crossing the street, you have no idea whether there's a truck barreling down the road. You have no idea whether the big tamale isn't about that far away from you. We don't know. So that complacency is like a delusion. It's a drunkenness. It's a danger. And we seem to all have it. We seem to all have it. We seem to think, all right, well, why is she bugging me? I'm starting to practice some Dharma. I'm coming every Sunday. Well, what are you doing the rest of the week? You know, are you sure you're going to be here next Sunday? Maybe you should make the best of this week. It could be your last one. That could happen. That sounds very depressing, doesn't it? And we don't like to talk about that. But not talking about that is like trying to negotiate your way across a room, knowing that there's furniture in the room, and having that room be completely dark, knowing that there's a big mess in the room, and that it's real questionable what's going to happen once you enter into that room, but leaving the light off and leaving the windows closed and just going through the room in absolute blackness because it's too messy to turn the light on and look. That's really what that attitude is like. It's stupid. It's really stupid. We need to look at the options. We need to look at the possibilities. We need to turn on the light and say, I get it. There's a bit mess over here, and there's a mess over there, and there's a big sofa over there, and there's a chair over there. And it's a good thing I looked, because if I'd walked in the room in this condition with the light off, I probably would have tripped over that chair. It's really good to open the eyes, to get the big picture, that it's possible for things to change very rapidly, that it's possible for our particular space and time, which is comfortable now, to be very short term. It's very possible for life to be short. It's not what we want, but it is possible. We should explore that possibility. Why is it that we have to play this game of saying, I'm going to live forever? Why is it we have to turn to something really relatively flimsy, like that kind of positive thinking, and say, I'm never going to age, when so far no one has proved that right? Everyone has aged, everyone is aging, and everyone will leave this incarnation. Why do we feel compelled to turn to something flimsy like that? Why do we comfort ourselves with looking in the mirror and saying, I'm still young? Why do we need that? And it's the reason why is that we're afraid to die. We're afraid of it. It's an unknown. We don't know what it's like. We're afraid of the aging process. We're afraid of what it means. We're afraid of what we may not be able to do. We're afraid of the unknown that comes with that. We're afraid of moving through this passage. We want to stay right where we are. But the bottom line underneath that is that we are afraid of change and we are afraid of death. What can you do about that? Do you think that the solution for that is to simply try to convince yourself that you're staying in a stable way right where you are? Do you think that the answer is delusion? Do you think that to make yourself feel less anxiety-ridden about the potential for death is to say, well, I've probably got a good 20 years left? Does that sound reasonable to you? Of course it's not reasonable. You should look at that fear of death head on. You should look at the fault of cyclic existence head on. That is what the Buddha calls the fault of cyclic existence. That changeability, that lack of confidence, the knowing that one has been born and that one will die. The inability to be safe within that in that it is constantly changing. Impermanence. Particularly and specifically in the human realm, the sufferings are old age, sickness, and death. Generally speaking, in all the realms, one suffering is the suffering of suffering, and another suffering is the suffering of impermanence. The Buddha suggests that we examine. Isn't it so that we've lived with this every day of our lives? Isn't it happening all around us? Don't you see old age, sickness, and death? How can you deny that? You can't deny that you do see it. And the Buddha suggests that once you decide that it's really there, there's a different way to deal with it besides delusion. One can apply the antidote. One can apply a means by which to overcome the necessity for the continuation in the cycle of birth and death. One can apply, certainly, and this is an immediate thing that one can apply, is the antidote to the fear of change and the fear of death. Because what makes us afraid of death is that we're not looking at it and we're not handling it. We are not turning the light on in that room. We're afraid to walk through it. We're not seeing what's really there. And the other thing is that we're afraid of death. And why are we afraid of death? Because we haven't prepared for death. We haven't. Even if we've written out wills, even if we've left money to our children, we've prepared for them, but we haven't prepared for us. We are not prepared for the experience of death. We do not know what the consciousness does at the time of death. We are not convinced of the survival of consciousness. We don't even know what that survival means. What is this that survives? We have all these questions. We have no idea whether or not one can negotiate the experience of death intelligently in the same way that one can negotiate the experience of life. We just don't know. And so not knowing and not having anyone to turn to that you can ask, and you know you don't have anyone to go with you, you just wonder, how are you going to make it through this? What's happening here? And the best thing to do is stay right where you are, and so you use that kind of delusion process. According to the Buddha, there is a better way. Having examined for yourself the faults of cyclic existence and seeing for yourself that this fearfulness is not something you want to live with, and this doubt and this terrible anticipation of change that we are, this dread that we live with constantly, that causes us to try to keep everything under control, to manipulate everything and everyone around us so that nothing will change. This is a terrible way to live. The Buddha teaches us instead that we should learn the technology of living and learn the technology of dying. The Buddha teaches us that we should open up to and approach the idea of negotiating the ocean of cyclic existence. Then our next decision, when we look at the faults of cyclic existence and see that there really are such things and really see that this is just not working out for us, it's really not working out for us. We're not doing this skillfully. And we're carrying around with us a lot of baggage having to do with fear and with lack of skill. Then the next thing that we should do is decide for ourselves who should teach us this method. How should we come by this method? Very often, ordinary people arrive at these conclusions on their own. And I've had people come to me that never had any exposure to Dharma before that said they feel that life is kind of a shell without some sort of spiritual depth. I think we can all agree that that may be the case, that there has to be some spiritual depth. But then they think a little bit more deeply and they think, well, it's not only that we need spiritual depth and that life is just a shell without it, but that it seems as though to have the skills to make money and bear children and raise a family and do all that kind of thing is simply not enough. It's like we have to have more. And I hear complaints like, well, why is it that you can't go to school or you can't go to university and get a degree in life? You know, why can't you get a degree in life experience? Why can't you come out of these learning situations competent? How come you can go to school and get a PhD and be specifically smart in one tiny little thing and go through the rest of your life feeling like a complete ninny? That you were not taught how to be stable, how to be competent in some general way. These things you were not taught. And so maybe we should look at becoming competent in our minds. Maybe we should look spiritually. So what should we do now? These people have already arrived at these conclusions. The danger of arriving at that conclusion by yourself is that you may not understand all the issues, you see. You really may not understand all the issues. You may think that to become competent in your mind could mean simply becoming emotionally competent, becoming psychologically competent. Knowing, for instance, that you had certain life experiences in the early part of your life that led you to react in certain habitual ways. And you may think that learning about that, perhaps through studying psychology, or perhaps through going to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, that may be enough. But I think if you take that approach, you may not be knowing all the facts. And I'll get into that in just a minute. I'll explain that in just a minute. But then you may also look around and you may say, well, I'd like to I'd like to enter onto an experience, kind of a phase in my life where I'm a seeker. Lots of people that come to me and want to study Dharma have been seekers for some time. And they actually really like that word. That's highly prized. It kind of gives you the image of being kind of a noble person, living the profound life, and deep. You're deep, man. So, so you're a seeker, and then the problem with being a seeker is that if you're a seeker now, you're going to die a seeker too. And I just definitely want to know that by the time I die, I have found something. You know, I don't think that's a good thing to be. I really want to be there by the time I leave. I want to be in the boat. So I don't want to be looking for the dock. You know, I want to be in the boat. So, if you get my drift. So a seeker, you know, that seeker philosophy usually means that people are looking at lots of different stuff. They're looking at some psychology. They're looking at what else do spiritual people look at? Let's see. They're looking at some meditation, and they're looking at some positive thinking, and they're looking at some philosophy, and they're looking at some health food, because that's what New Age people do, and then they're looking at body work. Thank you very much. And we're looking at crystals and New Age music, right? And then we're going to start channeling pretty soon. And it just sort of goes from there. And you can go in lots of millions of different directions. But if that's what we're doing, I really propose that we don't have all the facts. First of all, we're continuing in a very diluted way to assume some very diluted things. And first of all, if you take those routes, what you're basically thinking is, this is all there is. Even though you're looking at all kinds of different philosophies and meditations and stuff, you're thinking this is all there is. Because if you are trying to explore, only taking into account what you are right now, a human being, if you're trying to learn meditation as a human being, if you're trying to psychologically untangle your psychology or your psyche or whatever it is that you have going on for you, looking at some of the early experiences of your childhood as being reasons for your habitual behavior, you are assuming that that's when you started. You are. You're assuming that you started at that age and that you came into this life a relatively clean slate with no cause and effect relationships before that, previous to that, that had anything to do with your life now. And basically that means you're a victim. You have not got all the facts. You've been victimized by your circumstances. They have shaped you. That isn't the truth. According to the Buddhist teachings, we have been accumulating cause and effect relationships since time out of mind. We have lived many, many lifetimes and have habitual tendencies that extend far into the past. Strangely, women seem to know that better than men. And I think that they know that because they have a sense, for instance, we have a sense of watching our children being born. We can have the same children born very close together. They can be twins. They can come from the same parents. They can be born into the same house. They can be very, very similar, and they can be similar in their timing, but they can be completely different. Unbelievably different. Nurses in hospitals report that some babies are born and they seem to be born angry. They seem to be born stressed. They seem to be born unable to cope. While other babies seem to be born very accepting, very open, very ready, very peaceful. How can that be so? Women see that more than men do. I think it's easier for us. We kind of are in touch with that process. We see that that's true. We have more to do with the everyday goings-on of our children, and we realize that sometimes the cause and effect relationships don't match with what that child is doing. It doesn't seem to fit together. We have a sense that these people that are coming in are people already. They're already something. They're already established. They have certain habitual tendencies. They have certain characteristic modes of perception and certain ways of acting. And seeing that, sometimes I think we have a strong sense of something that is continuing, something that has been continuing for a long time. How many times have I talked to mothers, and I've really only seen this from women, so I don't honestly know if men have the same kind of experience. Tell me if you do. I don't know that, but I've talked to women that have the sense of giving birth to a child and recognizing that child and knowing, I have known you before. You're coming back to me again. I know you. I've had that experience with my children. There's a sense of continuity. We need all the facts. We need to know that it's not just one life experience, that there is something else to deal with. You can't solve the problems that we're experiencing now if all you're looking at is 80 years. If you're looking at this tiny little piece of time, you can't solve it. You can't fix this one only with looking at the way you were raised. You can't fix this one with only looking at some meditation technique that's going to calm the mind, this one that you have right now. You have to address the continual experience of cyclic existence. And the Buddha teaches us that when we approach the path in these haphazard ways, we're not doing that. That what we need to do when we think of approaching the path, when we think of approaching the cessation of suffering, the crossing of the ocean of cyclic existence, the continual birth and death process, is we have to address the need to find a guide and to find a system that works not only with one small slice of time, but works in purifying the mind stream, even that portion of the mind stream that are the habitual tendencies and the karmic cause and effect relationships, the karmic realities that we have incurred previous to this lifetime. We have to address those things also. According to the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha teaches us that therefore we should approach a system or a guide or a method that not only addresses that, but addresses that from the point of view of enlightenment itself. Because all of us that are caught up in cyclic existence, are just that, caught up in it. We are really unable to see back into the deep past, into that which is just time out of mind, because it's just that, it's time out of mind. I mean, we can take a flying leap at it. We can think, oh, I had a dream once about being a shoemaker in one of my past lives, so maybe I was a shoemaker in one of my past lives. Or we can go to a psychic and she can tell us 10 lives that we absolutely were, one of which is guaranteed to be Nefertiti. Because I have met her many times. It just happens too often. I just think that she really must have been a multiple personality. Anyway. So you find out what you are 10 different times, and you take a flying leap at that, and you think that you've got it nailed, but according to the Buddha, that doesn't cover even the tiniest millisecond of eternity. And we have been here, involved in this process of cyclic existence, since time that we can't measure. What do we do now? Who's our guide? What do we look to? We should decide for ourselves if cyclic existence is faulted. Is it a problem? We should decide for ourselves whether we're handling it well. Are we happy living with fear and the unwillingness to experience change? The fear that change will bring us misfortune. Are we having a hard time with that? And if so, having decided that and having looked at that with our own minds, no one can tell you whether or not cyclic existence is faulted. You have to look at it. Having decided that, then we should decide for ourselves whether we should apply the antidote. Wishing to apply the antidote, we should think, what is the perfect method to do this? What is the way to do this? Should we allow ourselves to be instructed completely through our own 5 senses? Should we ascertain the path for ourselves? Should we make one up? Well, we have made one up. We've made up confusion, fear of death, fear of change. This is what we're doing now. This is the method. These are the coping methods that we have come up with ourselves. We've made up a path. Do you like it? Maybe we need some help. Okay. So then what do? Do we then look at someone who is also caught in cyclic existence? Have you ever noticed that the person that you go to for psychological help, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't go for psychological help, I recommend it on a regular basis, but if that's all you do, have you noticed that you're putting your hands on someone who is themselves quite deluded? I mean, don't you hear horror stories of psychiatrists that drink like fish and smoke like chimneys? And just, in their own lives, they're kind of out there in the ozone. That can happen. So it doesn't mean they're not competent to help you point out certain patterns, but it may mean that you wouldn't want to follow them into the abyss. They cannot, perhaps, solve all your problems. And then, do you want to turn to someone who's made up a system, made something up? For 20 years, I've discovered that I'm going to follow this certain mental system of positive thinking and reinforcement and blah, 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 and exercise, and pretty soon we're all going to get enlightened if we do that, because I got that in a vision. Note that no one so far has gotten enlightened with that method, and note that that person also is not enlightened with that method. I mean, just think. That's all I'm telling you to do. Arrive at that conclusion for yourself that you haven't quite got the answer yet, and then think what the answer might be. The answer might be that if you really wish to cross the ocean of cyclic existence, you should take the advice of someone who has done so. It's kind of like getting directions to go to the mall. You want to get them from someone who's gone there, you know, who knows how to drive the car. That's what you want to do. You don't want to go to, you could go to my daughter, she's 2. My daughter is very competent at being able to tell people what to do. You can ask her advice about anything and she will give you instructions that go on for hours. And she's adamant about them. She's absolutely right. You should follow her instructions. But I wouldn't use her instructions to go to the mall, would you? And that's what we're doing when we play that game with our lives. It's a gamble. What a stupid gamble. Look for signs. Look for those that have achieved Buddhahood. It's not only the historical Buddha that has achieved Buddhahood. Look for those practitioners. Look at the history, for instance, of Vajrayana. There are stories of practitioners who have achieved such remarkable results that at the time of their death, their body produced miraculous relics. And people have those relics. I mean, I have, for instance, there is a great Lama who was considered a living Buddha, who died a couple of years back, who really, I would say, attained nirvana a couple of years back. The circumstances surrounding his death were miraculous. He was going to die earlier, but his students came to him and requested him to live, and he miraculously said okay, and then got better immediately. Lived a little bit longer, did a few more things, and said, now I've really got to go, because it's really time. And then he went, and he died. He didn't die the way most of us die. We sort of drop dead and foam at the mouth and do ugly things like that. He sat in the Vajra position, full lotus position, and simply left. And his body remained not undergoing the changes associated with death for a very long time. Warmth remained there for a very long time. And then finally, when his body was preserved in salt in the traditional way, previous to its being put in a stupa, they put him in they did that, preserved him in salt and put him in a box, and then when they unboxed him to put him in a stupa, his body had produced pearls. Pearls had come out from his body and they were surrounding his body. I have some of those. I've seen them with my own eyes. These things happen. These stories are common. Well, not really common, but there are lots of them that have happened. I have a piece of jewelry, a traditional piece of jewelry called a gao, that has many relics in it, relics that the bodies of these realized beings have produced. Why am I telling you this? So that you can envy my gao? No, you probably will, but you know. I'll let you see it someday. But that's not why I'm telling you this story, so that you can understand the difference between something like that and maybe getting a weekly back rub. Do you see the difference? There's an enormous difference. It's thinking it through. Get the big picture. Do you want relaxed muscles? Which is fine, you can have that. Or do you want to cross the ocean of suffering? These ones that are they have achieved something. It is possible. It is possible to achieve these miraculous results. These are the things that we want to think about when we choose what to do with the rest of our lives. What do you want? Do you want to make something of the rest of your life? What should it be? Should it be a vehicle for compromise? Should it be a vehicle for short-sightedness? Or should it be a vehicle in which you cross the ocean of suffering? Should it be a vehicle in which you practice the proper technology so that when death occurs, and it will, you are totally prepared for it? There are all sorts of technologies that you can practice, and we have practiced here, and we do practice. One, for instance, called POA, in which one practices ejecting the consciousness, transferring the consciousness at the moment of death. One knows exactly how to do that, and one practices it, so that when that occurs, one is prepared. Why should you be afraid of death then? Why should you grow old faster being afraid of death? Why would you want to do that? Death then becomes an opportunity because there's a moment when one enters into the bardo and all of the elements dissolve. One can recognize the nature at that moment. This exists in the world now. Why do we play around? Why do we walk through life like kids that will not turn the light on in the room? Why do we do that? Does it make sense? Think about it. That's all you're being asked to do. No one's got a chain around your neck dragging you into this. Just think about it. Think for yourselves. We think that we think for ourselves, but we don't. We just react. Think for yourself and come to your own conclusions. Let me know what you want to do.
Juling minutes the dark hunger.